Hi, this is Brooke, and today I'm really excited to be talking to Brad Marshall, who's been, you know, talking all about stearic acid. It's all about stearic acid. I'm so fascinated with his work and his journey, and welcome, Brad. I'm so glad that you're here to talk.
Hi, thanks for having me. Um, so I got, you had asked before about how I got started on my low carb journey. And so I read Dr. Atkins' book back in like 2002. So I've been a long time person who's done, keto and low carb diets throughout my adult life. I've struggled with obesity since I was a kid. And so it's been very helpful for me, and I've used it a lot. But I've been very, very busy as I was running a farm and a butcher shop, and I kind of, just wasn't paying too much attention to my diet for a number of years because I was just overwhelmed with work, and I just didn't have the mental capacity to even think about it for a while. And so I did gain a significant amount of weight. On my, I stepped on the scale on, New Year's Day, as people do, of 2019. And I realized I was like, 60 pounds overweight. I was like 253 pounds. And so I went back to I spent the first 7 months of 2019 doing a lot of keto, experimenting some with carnivore. And I found that, the weight just didn't come off like it did when I was 25 and doing keto. And that's when I had, and so there's a blog called.
Can I ask, were you still running your butcher shop and raising pigs at this time?
No. So I was, I was out of that, my old business as of last, well, no, I guess I was in the beginning. Yes, I was. And so, I'm not doing that anymore. I have a new pork-based business called Firebrand Meats, where we're selling low PUFA pork, and everyone should come buy a share of that. But I'm done with the old business. And so and that's why I've had more time to actually work on my blog and get some of these ideas out there. Right. And so I've been a longtime reader of a blog called Hyperlipid, and written by a guy called Peter Dombromilski, perhaps. I can't pronounce his last name. I'm not going to pretend to. But anyways, it's a fascinating blog. It's very dense.
And you have a background in research, don't you, yourself?
Right. I have a genetics degree from Cornell, and I did. I worked in a lab out of college. I did lab work at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. And so, yeah. So I have the science background to kind of understand some of what is going on in the blog Hyperlipid. And so when I couldn't lose weight, I spent a lot of time reading Hyperlipid. And that's when I got my idea for the croissant diet, which is kind of cheeky, obviously, because the more I looked at it, I started to question whether or not the root cause that I was struggling with was carbohydrates per se, or the quality of fats that I was eating. And so the more I read Hyperlipid, I started to realize that, in fact, the problem might be getting too much of something called linoleic acid, which is a polyunsaturated fat, which is the main component of soybean oil and corn oil. And it's basically in, soybean oil especially is in everything, right? It's in breads and crackers, but it's also, if you order eggs at the diner, they're going to fry it in soybean oil. So this is a really pervasive thing that's all around us in ways that we don't even think about. Like, ordering eggs at a diner, for instance, is a good example of that. You think that you're getting the right fats. And oh, by the way, they also fed the egg-laying hens soybean oil, so the eggs are also surprisingly high in linoleic acid. So that's another sort of Trojan horse way that linoleic acid gets in because of what we feed the pigs and the chickens. And so it's kind of a really hard thing to get away from.
Which actually brings up, sort of underscores maybe how with the carnivore diet, when people really focus on ruminant meat, they see all these wonderful improvements.
Exactly, because they've changed the types of fats. Because ruminant meats, what cows do is in the rumen of the cow, it's not really the cows that do it, but the little creatures that live in the cow's rumen actually hydrogenate the fats, and they turn the polyunsaturated fats into saturated fats. And so, yeah, when you switch from eating pork and chicken and beef to eating all beef, like you say, that's when people see a lot of improvements. And my hypothesis for why that would be is that you've changed the ratio of fats in your diet to be much more saturated and much less unsaturated. And so that's the whole idea behind the croissant diet is you're consuming a lot of a very saturated fat. And so there's an article in Mice, and they, Valerie Reeves, when she did her thesis, she fed mice basically starch and stearic acid, and the mice got thin. And I said, well, that's interesting because one, that's, to feed something starch and fat together and see it get very thin is like, that's what everybody thinks is the exact wrong thing to do. But I also looked at it and said, well, that looks like how one makes a croissant, because I have a culinary background as well. I went to the French Culinary Institute. And so that gave me the idea to the diet. And I thought, how do I test this idea that in fact, maybe it's not just about the carbs, but that this specific fat is important. And so I decided to make the croissants as sort of a way of handicapping it, right? Because if I did very high saturated fat in the context of keto, then maybe I just lost weight because I was ketogenic. And so I didn't want that to be the case. And that's why I started making the croissants. But it worked. I mean, once I started eating, lots and lots of highly saturated fat, I lost weight right away, and I lost inches off my waist. I mean, it was like so fast, and I'm still on that weight loss journey. I've been doing, there's another article on my blog now called the feasting mimicking diet. What I've realized is if I eat a very big meal with lots of saturated fat, then I can I can basically fast after that for a long, long time. And so I'm sort of doing this, one meal every other day approach. And I fast through the other days, except actually I drink wine because I call it wine fasting. There's an article on the blog about that because that, for me, is someone who's a regular wine drinker, the wine blunts my hunger. So if I get some hunger the evening of the second day, I have some wine and I cruise right through until the next day. And so this is actually one of my kind of feast days. So I'm looking forward to, in a couple of hours here, having I'm actually doing steak frite right now. That's my feast meal. So
very nice.
I make a bunch of my Fat Bomb fries that are fried in beef suet, and I have steak with the stearic acid butter oil sauce on it. And it's a classic bistro dish, so it's another fun kind of playing with the French historical diet concept that I write about a lot of my blog.
And I'm sure classically the French cooked those frites in tallow, I would guess.
So yeah, and so Elizabeth David is a very good classic cookbook author from she's British, and she wrote a lot of really good historical cookbooks, and she did a French one. And in her French cookbook, she actually says the preferred frying fat of the French is beef suet. So the classic French fries would have literally been made in beef suet, how I'm making them now. And so that's
supposedly McDonald's originally made their French fries in beef suet.
They did, or at least beef tallow. So and this is another. That's actually a really interesting differentiation, right? Yes. Because I think people think that they're like, oh, it's beef fat, right? And it's like, yeah, but really the ratio between like the kidney fat or the suet, and like the fat that's in a ribeye is actually very different. So, and when you look at all the different parts of the animal, they have all different, and in fact, bone marrow is surprisingly high, interestingly, in monounsaturated fats, which isn't, well, I'm not sure if that's counterintuitive, but it's interesting that depending on where on the animal you're getting the fat, the ratio of saturated to unsaturated fat can be very different. And, you know, if I call it on my website, I call it the Ros Theory of Obesity. And what's interesting about it is it attempts to explain why it is that a Chinese peasant can eat mostly rice and stay thin, and a ketogenic person can eat mostly beef fat and stay thin, and a French person can eat starch and butter together and stay thin, but why it all breaks down once we start introducing linoleic acid and polyunsaturated fats. And so, you know, I'm kind of proposing that at the end of the day, it's not so much about carbs. That's not to say that reducing carbs won't help someone who's metabolically unhealthy, but I'm arguing that perhaps the root of the problem is actually the linoleic acid that we're eating, that is literally building up inside of all of our bodies, because, you know, linoleic acid is the one food that when you eat it, you just store it and your body becomes made of it. Because like if I feed you know, if you eat a piece of bread which has wheat protein in it, wheat gluten, you break that gluten down into individual amino acids and you rebuild your own proteins out of it. You don't become made of gluten. You know, if you eat starch, your body doesn't, I mean, it stores a little bit of it as glycogen, but your body's going to convert the starch to fat and store that, right? And so these vegetable oils are really...
And can I ask you, when it does that, when it converts it to fat and stores that, what's the fat that it converts it to?
It usually stores it, and a metabolically healthy person will store it as a roughly 50-50 blend of saturated fat and monounsaturated fat. So yeah. Humans cannot make polyunsaturated fat. You have to get them from your diet. So by definition...
Same with the monogastric animals like pigs.
Same with pigs and chickens, right. And so that's why I'm over at Firebrand Meats and trying to like generate... I'm providing low PUFA meats in general, but I'm also trying to just generate awareness around this topic and like help people to understand that like, right, the types of fats that I eat make a big difference, even if I, you know, something that's like pork fat, everybody knows is like saturated, right? But it's not really. I mean, it is, some of it is, but it makes a huge difference. What you feed the pigs and the genetics of the pigs also make a huge difference on how saturated their fat actually is. And so, you know, classically, you have like nice bacon was made in, it was well known like that Europe, like American bacon, this is interesting, always sold for less in European markets than European bacon. And the reason is that European bacon was typically barley finished, and barley is a lot lower in vegetable oil than is corn. And so the American bacon was soft and the fat was floppy, and Europeans didn't like it. And so, you know, American pork bellies were like the last resort that people would pay like 30% less for than a barley finished pork belly. And so that, you know, that's sort of where I started getting some of my ideas, was looking at these historical texts about, you know, agricultural history and realizing like, wow, what you feed the pigs really does change them. And those also would have been like old fashioned pigs who, you know, make their own fat. So they're not forced to rely on getting vegetable oil out of their diet like modern long, lean white pigs are, that like Tyson and Smithfield are raising. So, you know, a heritage breed pig, interestingly, a heritage breed pig, something like a Berkshire, if you finish it on barley, the fat composition becomes very similar to beef fat. And so it's another source of nice, what I would call nice high quality fat, right?
And this was the lard that used to be consumed. This healthy lard used to be consumed by our ancestors, or
Right.
by this.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and in Europe, there was all kinds of they make lardo, which is just, they take the back fat and you salt it and cure it. And then you just slice it and eat it on bread. My mom grew up in, rural upstate New York, and they would make lard sandwiches, just lard spread on bread.
Well, it's really interesting when you mentioned that when we take on too many carbs, whatever, and we are storing it into fat, we and those animals don't store it into polyunsaturated fats.
Exactly.
We store it into fat that we actually are meant to eat. So that kind of underscores what kind of fat that we should be eating.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is I think that's a huge part of it. And so, and so with that in mind, when I started the croissant diet, one of the things I was thinking about is, okay, if I'm going to try to lose weight by changing my fat ratios, one issue is that, so this all happens via a specific mechanism in the mitochondria. The very, very short version of that is saturated fat causes reactive oxygen species to be formed in the mitochondria, and that's a signal which tells the mitochondria to stop listening to insulin. And insulin is telling your fat cells to stop releasing fat for the rest of the body to eat. So the primary mechanism of insulin, or one of the primary things that insulin does, is it makes your fat cells stop releasing fat to the rest of the body. So one of the questions I've always had is, okay, well, if I'm fat, then why am I hungry? Doesn't make sense, right? On just a very basal level. Like, if I'm so fat, why am I hungry all the time? And one of the reasons is that you're making a lot of insulin, and that insulin is telling your fat cells, don't release any fat for the rest of the body. And then you have all this fat, but it's all locked up by insulin. And so you're hungry, and then you eat more and you store more fat. And so what the saturated fats do is they tell the fat cells to stop listening to insulin, and therefore your fat cells continue to feed the body. And that is why you're not hungry after you eat highly saturated fat. And so, but what I also kind of realized in the beginning was okay, but I also know that I have all this stored polyunsaturated fat. So that's why I started eating meals that were both very high in fat and very saturated, because I knew that my fat cells would be running on kind of a blend of stored dietary fat or stored fat and dietary fat. And so I wanted to kind of overwhelm them for the purpose of satiation and, have them keep doing lipolysis.
Yes, because isn't it, whatever fat we've given ourselves, don't we make all of our cell membranes from fat? And so we're holding on to fat because all of our cell membranes have lipids in them. So depending on the fat we've been eating, all of our cells will be lipids. So yeah, that's great. And so if you're turning over and consuming your own fat in your body, which we're supposed to do, then you're taking in all these polyunsaturated fats, if that's what you've been eating for the past several years. So this idea of trying to sort of measure, trying to sort of make a sweet spot with adding extra stearic acid makes such good sense to me.
Right. Yeah. And obviously that was that was my initial inspiration. And then, if people read Introducing the Croissant Diet article on my website, I kind of talk about my whole thought process and thinking that out and being well, there's a section called Here's Why I Thought It Would Work. And then after that is a section called Here's Why I Worried That It Wouldn't Work. And so I kind of try to make my thought process on that very, very open.
Hey, can I just slip this in? Is there any, have you discovered, are there any negatives with eating, besides eating too much fat, but with eating too much stearic acid?
So a lot of people complain that it's really hard to rinse off of dishes and that it can clog your sink drain. These are real problems. I mean, it's not a dietary problem, but it is a real world problem. I haven't personally had anything that I would call a real negative. It is sometimes it is kind of like waxy. So sometimes people don't enjoy the waxiness of eating it, but I haven't found any like health problems from it, I would say. It's been pretty good. Yeah. I like it.
Well, I have to also bring this up because it's given me, with my own playing around with it from inspired by your work. So my own sort of fat lab kitchen.
Nice.
It's given me this kind of new appreciation of cocoa butter and chocolate, and how, when I think of the Swiss, who are usually pretty lean, and they really eat a lot of dairy, good breaded dairy, a lot of cheese and butter and chocolate. It's made me think about chocolate and its stearic acid content.
Right, exactly. And so here's another fun thing to think about is that, so I use a lot of, historical thinking about historical diets, in France and, like you say, Switzerland, and those people tend to be lean, and the diet is mostly based on typically dairy and wheat, right, are the main things. And dairy fat, most people probably don't realize, is actually significantly more saturated than beef fat. So butter is way more saturated than like eating a ribeye steak. And those, like you say, those cultures who are eating flour and butter and chocolate, they stay lean on that diet. And so, it kind of makes you think, right? You go like, there's gotta be some magic there. And I didn't ever know what it was. And then I started reading Hyperlipid, and then I was like, oh, okay, this might be the thing that actually can explain all of the different scenarios.
That's the French paradox.
That's the French paradox, right? Exactly. And I'm like, maybe this is it. Like maybe Peter has actually unwittingly solved the French paradox. So that sort of I guess that's where I come in.
And maybe stearic acid can actually help you speak French, if only.
Well, that would be nice.
That'd be great.
So I will say there was we talked about this on the main show, but I'll throw it out there. So there's a woman named Emmy, and there's a story on my blog called Emmy's Story, and she actually had the experience from a carnivore context. She was doing a ketogenic diet. I think she was postmenopausal. She had gained some weight. She had done keto and carnivore for, I think, 6 years without any weight loss, not a pound, And she had done pretty strict carnivore for about 2 years. And then she saw my blog, and then she switched to eating a lot of butter and cocoa butter. And almost immediately the scale started to go down. And she said at first it was only by grams per day, but then ultimately towards the end, her weight loss actually accelerated, which is sort of what you would expect if you were like slowly, getting rid of the polyunsaturated fat stored in your body.
Yes.
And so that's a really interesting story, and it's another perspective about changing fats, and so that's been a lot of people have found that really interesting, and a lot of women have reached out to me and said, this is interesting, but do you think it will work in women? And I said, well, I think so, but I can't, I can't prove it myself. And so that's been really interesting for a lot of people, I think.
Because I just wanted to say that in my sort of like experimenting with it seems like, so I reach a point of satiety, right on, straight up, even with a fatty coffee or chewing on some suet early on in the day.
Right.
But of course, that's just satiety. I mean, you still have to like not overeat.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And I found
not overeat. It definitely helps you not overeat.
Absolutely. No. And I found early on, like I've always struggled with satiety. And so I found, when I started eating these croissants with all the stearic acid, like I was like, wow, I'm really full. Like I actually don't want to, it's like I was making these plates of food that I normally would have polished off, and I was stopping, halfway through and thinking like, I just literally don't want another bite right now. Like it was like a hard stop signal, which I had never experienced before, honestly, in any diet. And I think that may have to do with the other organ that's monitoring for these reactive oxygen species production is the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is sending the satiation signal to your brain, and it does it in combination with a lot of other things like leptin. But I've sort of, there's an interesting experiment, and it's done in mice, but it suggests that this ROS production in the hypothalamus is sort of essential for the satiety signal. And they showed, I think, that using antioxidants, the mice would eat more because the antioxidants were actually soaking up the free radicals or the ROS.
So it would block so it sort of like would neutralize the signal?
It would neutralize the antioxidants neutralize the signals from the free radicals. And so they could knock out the satiety in the mice by giving them enough antioxidants.
So and that would be any antioxidants, whether it be vitamin A or C or...
Yeah, I mean, probably not the amount you would get in a regular diet, but if you take like a pharmaceutical amount of them, totally.
Oh, that's really interesting. Showing how I mean, that kind of underscores, not only how futile it is, but maybe how destructive it is of eating, lots of vitamins, high potency chemical.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think it's a good idea. And there's another study that I talk about on the blog with exercise. Men who they did a trial where men were given, one group was given antioxidants and one wasn't. I think it was vitamin C and E. And they went on the same exercise program while one was getting antioxidants and one wasn't. And at the end of the, 2 weeks or a month or however long it was, they couldn't find any measurable benefits in the group that got the antioxidants. It was like the antioxidants themselves blocked all of the benefits to exercising because, the reactive oxygen species production is the signal to the body that it's exercised. And it was like the body didn't do anything to, adjust to the exercise because they eliminated the signal from the ROS.
Oh, that's great. What's the name of that study? You remember?
I think on my blog, I don't know the name of the actual study. On my blog, there's an article called, I think it's called 2 Elegant Experiments Demonstrating that ROS is the Signal. And that's one of my favorite ones. It talks about C. elegans as well that I talked about on the main show. And it also has the exercise study. And I think they're both really interesting, showing that, in fact, these ROS are really doing things and they're important and we don't want to eliminate them. We
have this elegant design. Mother Nature is so...
Exactly. Because your body, and people don't really, I think people think of antioxidants as something that come from plants. But I've got a blog article called, I think, Meet Your Antioxidant System. And it, humans have a powerful inbuilt antioxidant system. We have to live in an oxygenated atmosphere because, oxygen is quite corrosive, and we would have all kinds of problems if we weren't able to deal with, oxidative damage. So of course we have this whole very robust built-in antioxidant system. And in fact, okay, so what happens if you eat a lot of antioxidants all the time? Well, your body wants to have balance between being overly oxidized, which is one end of the spectrum, and being overly reduced, which is the other end of the spectrum. Your body wants to be in the middle. So if you take a lot of antioxidants, your body responds by making less of its own antioxidants, right? So it the body's like, okay, well, we have all these antioxidants. We're not going to make any because, we already have them. So your body, regulates. Right. Your body reacts to it anyways, Yeah, no,
that's great. It just goes to show, it's how important it is to sort of really understand the mechanisms, which is why I love this, your train of thought with your work about trying to understand why, what exactly of the fats, why it's working and why it's not working. And it's really this idea of stearic acid. It's great.
Yeah. Or, saturated fats in general too, but
saturated fats in general. It's like palmitic.
Palmitic acid is the other long chain saturated fat, which is
from palm oil.
Really, most like things like butter and beef fat have more palmitic acid than they do stearic acid.
Is the palmitic acid from palm oil? Is that where that word comes from?
No. I mean, that's what it's named after because, you know, palm oil has a lot of palmitic acid in it. But we all, you know, like beef fat is something like 30 to 40% palmitic acid and like maybe 15 to 20% stearic acid, something like that. And human fat would be pretty similar to that if we were not all consuming soybean oil all the time.
Well, you know that banana smoothie study, wasn't that using palmitic acid and some stearic acid? Wasn't that?
No, well, so they say in that study that they are feeding people stearic acid. But I'm not sure how pure it is. A lot of the stearic acid available on the market is only about 50% stearic acid and 50% palmitic acid. They might have been using very purified lab stearic acid. They probably were, but I should, you know, it's actually an interesting question. I should go back and look at that. But yeah, you're talking about the study where people,
Right.
you know, they basically went on a vegan diet for a couple of days, and their mitochondria actually separate out into little individual mitochondria, and then they have this single banana smoothie with like 26 grams of stearic acid in it, and within hours, their mitochondria all fuse together and they switch over to burning fat.
You know, when they described the study as they fused together, I wasn't quite sure what that meant. You mean they all clumped together?
Well, there's if you pull up that paper, they actually have photographs, and it's quite. That's one of the things I like about it. It's very visual. You can see like they make these like branched networks. It's like a tree branch almost. Like they literally are just linking together and they're forming.
They reorganize themselves.
Right. They reorganize themselves to start burning fat once you eat stearic acid. And that's stearic acid taken in the context of a banana milkshake. So you're consuming, you know, starch and sugar along with the stearic acid.
So it didn't even matter about that there was this you know, high carbohydrate content in it. And I'm really interested whether you've teased that apart, whether there's like a big difference I'm sure there's differences. Well, I know there's differences. Sure. Carnivore. But what the differences are as far as weight loss, because you experienced this weight loss and you weren't doing a carnivore diet then, you were eating a mix of things.
Right, I was literally eating croissants at first. That's what
so I'm kind of wondering how that gets teased apart. Yeah.
What?
Like how that gets teased apart of the differences of whether carbohydrates are added in or not.
Yeah, and so I think, you know, I think of it all in the context of insulin, right? And so when you eat, you produce insulin, and that's true whether or not you're eating a steak or a plate of pasta. And you actually produce more insulin in response to a mixed meal. So if you eat protein with fat or starch with fat, you produce more insulin from eating starch than you do from eating protein. But either one of them, if you combine a starch with a fat or protein with a fat, you create more insulin. And actually, this is interesting, saturated fat leads to a higher insulin response than unsaturated fat. And so people say, oh, well, if it creates more insulin, then it's bad, except that you have to think about both sides of the equation, right? If your fat cells then ignore the insulin, it doesn't really matter that you're releasing some insulin, because the insulin, you know, is still maybe being used beneficially in other tissue types. And so, you know, and I talk a lot about, in my latest diet, the feasting mimicking diet, I call it, which is kind of a funny name, but I talk a lot about, and there's a article on my blog, they did a study in Spain where they feed people either butter or olive oil or vegetable oil. And what you see is that the group that gets the saturated fat, they're called free fatty. The fats that your the fat that your fat cells release for the rest of your body to eat are called free fatty acids. They're like floating around in your bloodstream, so they're available as food for the other cells. And if you eat butter, your free fatty acids rebound very quickly after a meal. And in fact, they go higher than they were. So like if you eat butter, it's like your free fatty acids start here and they drop in response to insulin, which they're supposed to do. But then they ultimately come back up here. But if you eat olive oil, it's like they stay down here for hours. And so it's like if you eat olive oil or vegetable oil, you might feel very hungry 3 or 4 hours after a meal because your fat cells have responded to insulin and they're not releasing the fat. But if you eat butter, your fat cells are like, yeah, there was some insulin, no big deal though. We're just going to keep doing lipolysis and keep feeding the body. And so, you have to think of, when you think of insulin, you have to think, okay, well, yes, we're producing insulin, but we're also ignoring it specifically in the tissues where it should be ignored, right? And and I guess that's a thing, right? Like insulin resistance is a decision that every cell in the body can either make or not make. It's not necessarily done at the organismal level. Like each cell can choose to be insulin resistant or not. And so that's Peter talks a lot about the idea of having insulin resistant fat cells in an otherwise insulin sensitive organism, or vice versa. The case with type 2 diabetes might be the opposite, that the organism is largely insulin resistant, but the fat cells themselves are still insulin sensitive. And again, this is Peter's term, but he calls it pathological insulin sensitivity, when your fat cells are.
Because you want it to actually be flipped. You want your fat cells to be insulin sensitive.
No, opposite.
Insulin resistant, and the rest
right.
of it be insulin sensitive. Exactly.
Exactly. That's the idea. That is the idea behind the yes. That's the basic idea behind the croissant diet.
So with your new tweak of the feasting diet.
Yes.
So you're able to fast for long periods of time. Are you eating some fat during that fast?
No, I'm drinking wine during that fast.
You're having a better time.
because I'm a wine drinker, and I discovered that if I have a little pang of hunger, the wine just kind of takes the edge right off that hunger, and I like drinking wine anyway, so it all made sense, right? Yeah. But I think you could. I think if if you're not a wine drinker, yeah, I think you could absolutely have like a little bit of fat, a fatty bone broth, or just eat some beef fat to kind of get through without having a huge insulin response. If you want to try to do like something like the feasting mimicking diet, where you're having a big meal and then just saying, I'm not going to eat for a while. Yeah, no, but I think you could definitely do it with fat. I would just say make that fat as saturated as possible. So
do you use a glucose monitor, a continuous glucose monitor?
I don't use a continuous glucose monitor. I use especially during the feasting mimicking diet, I use the poor man's continuous glucose monitor, which is just pricking your finger a lot.
Yeah. Do you, does wine spike a glucose response for you? I mean,
No, and this is interesting. So one of the things wine can do is it can stop gluconeogenesis, I think, I may have this slightly wrong, in the liver. And so what happens is, in a lot of people who are not what I like to call wine adapted, when they consume wine, their blood sugar drops. And that can lead to, the binge, right? Because you're like, oh, I had some wine and 3 hours later I'm starving, and then you get a pint of Haagen-Dazs or whatever. And so in my case, and actually there's studies that they've shown the same thing in mice, is that if you regularly consume alcohol, that stops happening. So I've literally, like, you know, drank a bottle of wine while testing my blood glucose 5 times, and it doesn't change, like, at all. In response to red wine. And I'm drinking, you know, totally dry red wine, so there's no sugar in the wine. But the ethanol, in my case, doesn't change my blood sugar at all. And so that's why I think I can use it as a fasting tool, which, you know, monks have done for forever, right? Certainly 1,000 years of monks have done what they have in Catholics, actually. So this is, and I talk about this in the wine fasting article, is that the classic Lenten calendar has days that are supposed to be, they call it wine and oil fasts. So you're allowed to have fat and you're allowed to have wine, and that's it. But this is like every, I want to say every Saturday and Sunday on the Lenten calendar is supposed to be a wine and oil fast. And so the idea of the wine fasting was discovered by the monks way before I discovered it. Very
interesting. And the oil that they would have been used in either animal fat or butter or olive oil, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this tradition, right, comes from monks in the Mediterranean, so they may have been using olive oil, but but obviously, Lenten monks in Ireland would not have been consuming olive oil on a oil and wine fast day. They probably, I assume they would have. I mean, I don't know them. I don't know exactly what they ate, but I assume it would have been butter or animal fat.
Very interesting. So what is your goal with the fasting diet? With the fasting mimicking diet, what is your goal?
The feasting mimicking diet is it's jokingly named on the fasting mimicking diet. So if you Google that, that's a totally different thing. That's not what I'm doing. You should. I mean, my goal right now is rapid weight loss. So at my peak weight, I was about 254 pounds. Today, when I woke up, I was 115 pounds. I'm trying to get down to about 190. And so when I initially did the croissant diet, you know, I had very rapid weight loss, and that was great. And then, you know, and then I just kind of like, I noticed when things were working and when things weren't. And I found just through trial and error that one, yes, I could use a meal that was high in saturated fat to start a fast. And I didn't have a lot of hunger if I did it that way. And I'm not a guy who I don't, I say this jokingly in the croissant diet article, but like, I didn't skip a dinner, you know, my whole life ever. Like, I was not a person who would skip dinner ever. Like, that was not an option that was on the table, right? Quote on the table. And so what I realized that if I ate a certain way, I could actually do it. I could actually go longer periods without eating. And so I was like, okay, well, let's try it. And so, you know, I tried a few things, and I found that one, if I could eat this big meal and then just fast for a while, I mean, I just lost weight at such a rapid pace. It was crazy. Like, you know, I was like, wow, and so that's when I, you know, codified the feasting mimicking diet. It's sort of like the croissant diet 2.0. It's like the macros are the same, but the pattern of eating is different, just purely through trial and error and figuring out what works. And so that's what I've been doing. And I lost, you know, I did it very strictly in like, I don't know, July, I think. And I lost 15 pounds in about 20 days. And so that was like really like, that was obviously very rapid, and weight loss. And that was great. And then I cruised around I actually kind of went on a road trip and went around the country. And then I really like brisket. And I was in a part of the country that had a lot of barbecue. So for a while I was basically doing like one meal a day of like brisket and mac and cheese, just eating things that stuck to the classic ratio of the croissant diet that I could get commercially, like very saturated fat with protein and a little bit of starch.
And weren't you even finding all butter croissants at places?
I was finding all butter croissants, I actually went and stayed with Amber O'Hearn and Siobhan Huggins, and I made a meal, and I grilled steak, and I ate my steak with buttered croissants from the, commercially available all butter croissants, and those guys didn't partake of the croissants, and that's cool. And so, but yeah, I did that, and so I cruised around the country eating fasting when I could, but it wasn't nearly as often because it was a little harder for me to do on the road, and I wanted to try all the barbecue joints. And so, yeah, I went back and forth from like eating the buttered croissants and going to barbecue joints and eating mac and cheese and all this stuff. And I finally got back, and I lost a pound during the trip. I was like, great, that shows that I'm like, okay, as long as I didn't gain anything, and I ate great. I loved how I was eating, and it was fun, and I was like, okay, that's cool. And so now I'm trying to get back into the into a more strict version, and I actually did 3 rounds, right? Each feasting and fasting period is like 48 hours. So I recently did 3 rounds pure carnivore, and that worked. It was, I got through it without too much hunger. There was perhaps a little more than with the starch for some reason. That might have to do with blood sugar levels.
So your pure carnivore, were you including suet with that, or your high stearic fat?
Oh, right. So, yeah, I also have this kind of crazy, I'm kind of a mad scientist, especially in the kitchen. So I'm working on these recipes for carnivore recipes, the ways that you can include a lot of saturated fat, very, very, in ways that are nice. They're palatable, and they're nice ways, instead of just like chomping down on raw suet, which is fine. I don't have a problem with raw suet, but personally I don't like it that much. I would rather have, a nice sauce or something. And so coming soon on Fire in a Bottle, I've got like 3 or 4 really cool ways that you can incorporate highly saturated fat as a carnivore.
Very good. Very good.
Hopefully, as soon as I get time to write, which hopefully will be next week, but we'll see. I don't know. Things keep coming up.
Very good. From what you had said earlier, okay, so when you were talking about, coming from a diet that's got a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids in it, or junk food or whatever, and all your cells are, have lipids in them, and you got to eat that up. And so balancing out and finding that sweet spot with a lot of stearic acid, because
right.
you get to that place, which might take a year or whatever.
Sure, who knows?
So then theoretically, I'm thinking you'd get to a point where you've been eating all saturated fatty acids, and that you wouldn't even have to focus on high stearic acid, but just continue on with just good saturated fats, and you would probably find this place where it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. The mitochondria is doing what it's supposed to be doing and pushing out free fatty acids when you need them.
Right.
So you wouldn't even so after a while, you wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't need to rely on this extra boost. I mean,
right.
The stearic acid really just helps you become fat adapted in many ways.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that's sort of like, when I was cruising around eating, brisket and mac and cheese, that was kind of a way for me to test that theory. It's like, okay, I've basically been seriously restricting any polyunsaturated fat in my diet since last July or so. And so, it's been about a year, I guess last August, 11 months now, where I've been super rigorous about eliminating all polyunsaturated fats. And so then I was adding extra stearic acid. And adding extra stearic acid, right, to get me into that mode. And so now I was like, well, maybe I'll try it with just eating, brisket and mac and cheese or, all butter croissants without adding any supplemental stearic acid. And it seems to have worked in the sense that I didn't gain any weight. I lost a pound. That was cool. Kind of unexpected. And so, I think in time hopefully we can get back to
Yeah.
a functional metabolism that works and eat
Which kind of brings us back to a little bit to this other project that you're working on with the pork production, with producing and being able to supply people with good pork.
Exactly. And so what I'm doing over at Firebrand Meats is I am feeding pigs a diet that is very, very, very low in linoleic acid, and they are old-fashioned genetics. They're actually a Berkshire cross. And so what happens is, like all animals, pigs can't make polyunsaturated fats. So if you don't feed them polyunsaturated fats, they won't have any. Here in the U.S., pigs are classically fed corn and also soybeans and sometimes supplemental soybean oil. And, corn is a fairly oily grain as grains go. It has more than twice the oil of barley or wheat. And so I'm following that model. I've been a farmer for 15 years. I've raised so many different types of genetics of pigs and given them different feeds, and I work with them in the butcher shop too, so I could see how the breed of pig and how what you feed it actually affects the fat firmness when it gets into the butcher shop, because saturated fat is very firm at room temperature, and polyunsaturated fats are oily, such as soybean oil. It's oily in the fridge. And so just by, I go into grocery stores and I literally just poke the pork fat, like on that rind of the pork chops. And you can actually tell how much polyunsaturated fat is in the pork just in it. I mean, I've seen enough that I know exactly how much is in there, just literally by how firm it is. Yeah. And so for years I've wanted this firm pork. One, it looks nice in the butcher case. But if you've ever had a steak with like a fat rind on it and it's got that nice firm, like it stands up to pressure, and pork fat is usually soft, and that's just because of the polyunsaturated fat content. And so I'm making these pigs. I'm doing a CSA style. People can sign up for a share, and then they get a box every month or every 2 months, whatever they sign up for, every 3 months, because that's the only way I can afford to do this, is to get people to sign up as sort of share members and kind of help me pay for the pigs and the processing, because it's a very expensive endeavor to do. But yeah, we're gonna have low proof of pork, and it's gonna be from Berkshire pigs. The meat quality is gonna be awesome. So I'm very excited, and it's getting close. They're almost here.
That's great. That's great. So they can sign up if they go to your
if they go to firebrandmeats.com.
What is it? Well,
firebrandmeats.com.
Firebrandmeats.com. And they can also find those links on your Fire in a Bottle website.
If they go to fireinabottle.net, yep, they click on the link at the top that says low proof of pork.
Okay, so what are you eating right now these days? What are you eating?
Okay, so I'm actually eating right now, in my current incarnation of the Feasting Mimicking diet, I'm eating steak frite, which is a classic French bistro meal, which is steak and French fries. But I'm using my fat bomb fries recipe off of the Fire in a Bottle website, which is the classic pomme frite they make in France. You fry the fries twice, because what happens is you fry them the first time, they're usually not that crispy, and then you cool them, and what happens is the starches in the French fries actually cross-link. So if you read about resistant starch on some websites, that's what's happening, is you're actually forming resistant starch, and then you fry them a second time, and it's the second frying where they get really crispy. And so what I found is that if during the cooling step, instead of air cooling them, I oil cooled them, which is to say I have 2 vats of beef suet, and I fry them in the one, and then I take them out of the heat and then immediately throw them into the relatively cool beef suet. And what happens is there's steam inside the French fry, and it quick cools, and the steam condenses, and that causes them to like wick up the beef suet. And so I did a bunch of experiments where I was, weighing the suet before and frying all the fries and weighing it after, so I could see how much fat the fries absorbed. And I found that doing the fat bomb method actually doubled the amount of suet that I could get into the French fries. And the whole concept,
it's total fat bomb.
It is. And so I think that, they're French fries, but in terms of, macro readings, it's like something like 75 to 80% of the calories are from fat. It's only 25% from starch, which is similar to a croissant, and I guess that's the thing. It's like people think of croissants as being like obviously a very high carb food, right? It's made out of flour, but when you look at the ratios, it's really only maybe 30% of calories from carbohydrate. So the the croissant diet really is a low carb diet. I don't usually go more than interestingly, this is something that I would have thought wouldn't be possible, but if I eat a feast meal that has 150 grams of starch in it, I'll still be in ketosis the next morning. Or, it'll go to almost zero after the meal, but by the next morning I'll be back up to not in high ketosis, but a 0.6 or a 0.7 on my Keto Mojo device. And then the next afternoon I'll be at 1.5. And so it was surprising to me how quickly you can bounce back into ketosis after eating, 150 grams of starch. But I don't know if that has to do with the high stearic acid content of the meal or the high saturated fat content of the meal. I'm not sure.
Or resistant starch, maybe.
Yeah, could be.
Can you eat very many of those French fries?
So, yes, this is the funny thing about the feast meal is I actually have to get in the zone. It's okay, with the satiation's going to hit, but we're going to work through it because, I'm not going to eat again for 48 hours. So I kind of make myself finish them, even though sometimes I don't even want to, but it's all right, I have to get my nutrition in somewhere. So I'm going to buckle down and finish this plate. I don't always make it all the way. It's a lot.
Is it possible? Now this probably sounds crazy, but is it possible to I made your butter with the the high stearic butter, butter, and you melt the butter down, and you melt the ghee down at that point,
right?
And then you add stearic acid powder. Is it possible to do that with suet, with tallow? Just to make it.
You could definitely do it with tallow. I mean, I think beef suet, and beef suet is not an easy thing to find. I
mean tallow from your beef suet. I mean good tallow
right
from your suet. So can you?
Right. Well, I guess what I'm saying is I feel like if you actually have beef suet, if you actually have kidney fat from a cow that you've rendered, it's already so high in stearic acid. I don't know that it's even necessary to add more. But if you had
33%, I think, right?
Right, exactly. But if you had beef, if you had beef fat that was rendered from cooking a steak or a chuck steak or something like that, that's only going to be 10 or 15% stearic acid. So I think you could supplement that with the stearic acid.
So you wouldn't do that with the suet tallow because it would just be just so rock hard, or
I think so. Yeah, the suet is already pretty waxy. Like I wouldn't push that any more than it already is. But
so 33% is about as high as you want to go.
I think so. Yeah, and it's an interesting number that shows up a lot because like cocoa butter is about 30 to 33%, and beef suet is about 30 to 33%. And when I added in the butter oil, you can get it up to about 30%, and that's like kind of the maximum you can go and still have it, sort of not turn to wax in your mouth. So it almost looks like there's like this like biological limit to how far, what percentage of saturated fat you can go to.
Although on your recipe, you say something about unless you're using it to incorporate it into a starch.
Right. So, right. So I was making, at the beginning of the original croissant diet experiment, I switched to doing pancakes because they're easier to make. But I found that pancakes are incredibly absorbent. You have no idea how much fat you can soak into a pancake. It's amazing. But in that case, when the stearic acid is really bound up in the starch, you can actually push it higher. Like I've gone to like 40, 45% even.
You mean you added the stearic acid powder to your pancake mix before?
No. So I made a pot with like, I put like a whole stick of butter and a bunch of stearic acid in it to where it was probably 40 to 45% stearic acid. And then you fry the pancakes in that, you're sort of like deep frying them. It's almost like fry bread because the fat is so deep that you're frying them in, and like 3 pancakes will absorb the whole stick of butter and all the stearic acid, and it's gone. And it's, now it's like in the starch somewhere, and then you just eat it like pancakes.
Okay.
So yeah, at one point I lost weight by eating stacks of pancakes.
So I love this. Yeah. So I love this. I mean, I think it's really exciting for people. I think it's really going to help people.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I mean, that'd be great. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's fun to play around with recipes. It'll be fun to see what other recipes you come up with.
Yeah. So everybody, if you want carnivore ideas, check back. Hopefully in the next 2 weeks, I'll have them all up at Fire in a Bottle. Fun carnivore ways to incorporate more stearic acid into your diet.
It's great having you on MeatRx. It was great to hear your meeting with Shawn. That was awesome, and that you brought up the pork industry and the problems that we have here in the States about that kind of monopoly thing going on for small.
Totally.
Especially because pork is so. I mean, I did a pig experiment myself. My partner and I had raised 2 pigs, and it was amazing just how fast it is. It's with under 6 months or 6 months, you have this huge animal to butcher. So,
totally.
Yeah. So it's really such a great animal for small farms to handle if they can't
Totally.
have the land to run cattle.
Right. Yeah, and that was the classic homestead pig. They would just keep them in the backyard and feed them the scraps, and the pigs would grow on that. And then at the end of the year, you'd have a pig. And
it is amazing how much they eat. It's like watching a car accident. Watching them eat is away.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, I have a butcher question to ask since you were a butcher. So
okay.
I know that the suet is found around the kidneys. That incredible thing of suet, casement of suet. Isn't it also found a little bit around the heart? Is that true? Is that suet also around the heart?
It is. Yes, it is. And so, yeah, like the top of the heart, you'll see it. And the other place you can find it is, this is hard to find, but if you get an untrimmed flank steak, it will often have suet on it, but usually they're all trimmed, so you don't really see it. But the flank steak is on the, one of the few cuts that are on the interior of the chest cavity. The flank steak is actually the diaphragm, so it's
close to the kidneys.
Right, exactly. It's called kidney fat, but it really wraps the entire abdominal cavity. They call it the kidney fat because after you've removed everything else, the kidneys are the things that are still like totally buried in the fat and will still be on the carcass. But yeah, it really aligns the entire abdominal cavity. And it probably was a very traditional food of hunters because it's when you've killed an animal and you open it up, that's like the most accessible, easy form of calories is the suet, right? Because it's right there. You don't have to cut the animal up or anything. You just open it up and there it is. So if you see circumstances like Native Americans, when they were hunting bison, they had ways they had these things called buffalo jumps, and they would just run the bison off of these cliffs that they couldn't see coming, and the bison would fall and they would run out and kill them. And sometimes they would kill like way more bison than they actually needed. But they would take the fat and they would take a certain couple of cuts. They would take the tongues. They liked the tongues and they liked what they call the humps. So they would take like the fat and the tongues and the humps. Sometimes they would just leave the rest of the bison there if it was too much for them to deal with. But
and that suet is so contained. It has that little thin membrane around it. It really is solid and contained.
Right, and I think they would have known to render the suet, and you remove the water, and then you just have the fat. I know, for instance, that Native Americans used a lot of bear grease in their cooking. They kept bear fat. This is a fun fact. A favorite dish of Native Americans in my neck of the woods, kind of New England and into New York, they would make maple sugar, and they would collect bear fat, and they would mix 50-50 bear fat and maple sugar together, and they would use that as a sauce that they dipped their roasted venison into.
It's like
So
a
this is like
sauce.
it's like a caramel sauce for their venison. And so that is like, you know, when I think of, you know, my series of articles where I have like the French diet in France and the French diet in upstate New York, that's like the French diet in action in prehistoric Native America. So it's, you know, it's a classic way of eating.
Yeah, and I also think of the mincemeat pies, which was suet.
Right, exactly.
And,
right.
and, you know, dried fruit and suet.
Totally. And there's another British one, which is Yorkshire pudding, which is basically like it's suet and flour, and you make like it's like a little souffle that you eat along with your steak.
Yeah. Very good. All things suet here.
Yeah.
This has been such a great talk. We could talk forever about food and history and the way the body deals with it. It's great.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. And it'll be up on the MeatRx platform. And thank you so much for coming on to MeatRx and talking to us, all things stearic.
Well, thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yeah. Continue on with your awesome work.
Thanks. I will.